Hi everyone, I want to comment about the Sydney siege as an Australian of Syrian descent. On Monday, I was up all night watching the tragic events unfold, as in Sydney, a terrorist held up a chocolate cafe filled with innocent people. This sleepless night wasn't the first, however. For the last 4 years, I've been watching Syria, my country of origin, go through the same thing on a daily basis. I was shocked when it started happening in a peaceful country like Syria, just as I was shocked as I watched it happen in Australia. Innocent people who just wanted a cup of hot chocolate on their way to work are now dead or injured. It brings up the question of what is responsible and how can we prevent it from happening again. I'm going to try to touch on everywhere the responsibility lies, but stay tuned because in the end, I'm going to argue that the people who are largely responsible are the ones you would least suspect. Well, the immediate blame can't escape the gunman himself. He was clearly a mentally deranged individual. The fact that one of his demands was an ISIS flag because he seemingly forgot his at home shows that he was just a lunatic and that this wasn't a sophisticated operation. Another tip that he's a crackpot is he passed a news station and an embassy and chose to hold up a chocolate cafe. Also, he was charged with a series of criminal offences ranging from plotting the murder of his wife to sexually assaulting 6 women. He put an ad in the paper claiming that he was a spiritual healer who was an expert in numerology, astrology, and black magic. He frequently changed religious sects. When he first came to Australia, he claimed he was seeking asylum from the Iranian theocratic government because he was too liberal. Then he started calling himself a Shia Sheikh, then he became a Sunni, and then he went full ISIS. That's like going from atheist to Catholic to Protestant to cult worshipper. Clearly, he was someone who wanted attention more than anything. So, can this count as a terrorist act with a political message if he was just some lone psycho? Well, you might say that those who are attracted to ISIS in the first place probably have some form of mental illness. But some of the responsibility also lies elsewhere. I say this as a Muslim, but the Muslim community needs to do a better job of weeding out the psychos. It might make Muslims indignant for me to have said this, but the fact is, you are not immune to the prevailing ignorance about what's happening in the world. Some of you are the worst offenders of that ignorance, and you're drenched in your own bias. And in the end, you're going to lose out the most as a result of it. I know some of you are not even interested in politics and are just busy going about your daily lives. In fact, I know many of you are, because I know them personally. But simply ignoring what's going on around you won't protect you from the consequences of other people's decisions. And that doesn't just go for Muslims, but for everybody. When Hizb ut-Tahrir has a meeting in Sydney and they're getting an audience, it's everyone's problem, but mainly, it's going to be the Muslim community's problem. I know there are people yesterday who didn't even leave their homes because they were afraid of a backlash caused by this psycho's actions. And to the individuals who are actually sympathetic to ISIS, stop acting like the victims. You are not immune to being imperialist oppressors. ISIS's main goal is to go overseas and kill people in order to steal their land. And the most disgusting thing of all is they're acting as though they're being oppressed while they're doing it. So, get off your high horse, you murderous, delusional pawns. And if you're some bogan who is thinking about attacking random Muslims going about their day-to-day lives, think again. I know a headscarved Iraqi woman that was harassed yesterday at a petrol station. What her ignorant harasser cannot fathom is that Iraq has faced far more terrorism than Australia. Iraq has suffered a countless barrage of car bombings that have killed hundreds of people since the start of the Iraq War 10 years ago. And that doesn't even include the US bombings. Only last month, my friend called me upset that her friend had died in a car bomb in Iraq. So why would you blame the people who are bigger victims of terrorism than you are? Your ignorance is part of the problem, and you're only going to provide the crazies with the propaganda they need to recruit more crazies. So can't you see that? Educate yourself before you misdirect your rage. You might think of blaming the courts who allowed gunmen out on bail. You may blame the psychiatrist who didn't put him in an institution. You may blame those who gave him asylum in Australia in the first place, even though his original country, Iran, warned Australia about him. Australia gave him asylum because he called himself a liberal running away from Iranian theocracy. The irony. The Australian government, which is anti-Iranian, found his rhetoric useful. In fact, he was interviewed by ABC as an Iranian dissident. So politics clouded our sight there and allowed this reject of society to live here. But I told you that the majority of the blame goes to those who you would least suspect. I think we can agree that what happened was unprecedented in Australian history. And it is a reflection of the fact that the world has had a heightened risk of terrorism now more than ever before, especially over the last 3 years. But Muslims have been living in Australia for generations, so what's changed? They keep telling us about the rise of ISIS and the increased risk of terror that has come with it. But has the media ever told you how ISIS came about? If you recall, 4 years ago was the start of the Arab Spring. The Australian media told us that it was a wave of democratic uprisings taking the Middle East by storm. In reality, the uprisings were led by religious extremists against the only remaining secular governments of the Middle East, and the United States supported them. One of the first countries to go through an Arab Spring is in Egypt. Obama called on the Egyptian dictator Mubarak to step down, but what replaced him was the Muslim Brotherhood political party led by Morsi. Over to Libya, the next country where an uprising took place. The US stepped in with airstrikes to support the so-called democratic rebels in overthrowing and lynching Gaddafi. And as soon as they did, well, an Al-Qaeda flag was flown over a Libyan courthouse, and since that day, Al-Qaeda has been all over Libya. Then to Syria, where the US supported, again, the Muslim Brotherhood. I said this on the Insight program in 2012. I also warned journalists at Insight that this would lead to repercussions for Australia. I said that I was afraid Syria would become another Afghanistan. And what has happened since? ISIS and Al-Qaeda are wreaking havoc, not just in Syria, but all over the world. The US and its allies are directly responsible. The rebels the US armed and trained took their arms and training and defected to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They even openly told The Independent that they are fighting alongside Al-Qaeda Jabhat al-Nusra. And just yesterday, an Al-Qaeda terrorist was pictured here with a Tau weapon the US gave to the Syrian rebels, and he was using it against the Syrian army. You see, what Sydney suffered through yesterday, Syria has been suffering from for 3 years. One man in Sydney was able to stop the entire Sydney CBD. In Syria, there are at least 40,000 like him. What happened in Sydney happens every single day in Syria, and the terrorists aren't just taking cafes hostage, they are taking entire cities hostage. In Australia, we are lucky to have a professionally trained and well-funded police force. But if you can imagine how much this one incident cost the state of New South Wales, and project that and assume it is a weekly occurrence, it would cripple the economy. Australia is worried about the threat of terrorists coming in from overseas. Syria is worried about the terrorists coming in from Australia. Right now, there is at least 150 Australians fighting for ISIS in Syria. Some were captured by the Syrian army and are in jail. But I think Sydney is still a hotbed of radicalization, and it began to fester at the start of the Arab Spring. Are you finding it hard to believe that the US government supported the rise of terrorism? Well, Hizb ut-Tahrir is an extremist movement in Sydney. Channel 7 filmed them letting their kids sing "We want to behead Syria's President Assad," along with a lot of other extremist rhetoric. In 2009, Obama had one of his representatives meet with a leader of Hizb ut-Tahrir, along with members of the Muslim Brotherhood. The hypocritical US foreign policy of backing extremists to get rid of governments they don't like goes back to the 80s in Afghanistan. The same American politicians who were involved in backing terrorists in the Middle East as recently as today were interviewed on Australian TV yesterday to express their sympathy over the Sydney siege. They also interviewed Netanyahu, the Israeli president. A couple of weeks ago, the UN wrote a report on how Netanyahu has been aiding Al-Qaeda in the Golan Heights. It's like killing someone, then crying at their funeral, and it's disgusting. You must be confused right now, because you were told the US is fighting ISIS and airstriking them. But even while they superficially bomb ISIS, their NATO allies Turkey are allowing ISIS to cross the border into Syria, as they have done for years. And their Gulf Arab allies Qatar and Saudi Arabia are funding millions of dollars into ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, aka Al-Qaeda. So how do you explain this? The US has only been bombing ISIS for 3 months, a face-saving measure. But the Syrian army has been fighting ISIS on the ground and in the air for years. But instead of supporting Syria, the US has sanctions on Syria, crippling their ability to fight Al-Qaeda. While Syria bombs ISIS, the EU has placed a ban on selling Syria jet fuel. I was watching the ABC, and right after the story about the Sydney siege, they ran a story about the Al-Qaeda rebels attacking the Syrian army and taking over a town in Idlib. But the ABC failed to make the connection between the two events, and I felt like I was taking crazy pills. So what is the connection to Sydney? The gunman, Manhunt, was making tweets about Syria, in particular against the Syrian President Assad. He said that Assad supporters were worse than animals. He and Obama share that in common. The media had filled his mind with ideas about Syria that caused him to sympathize with the fight against the government there. He was made to believe that ISIS is an all-powerful, unbeatable force. The extremist sheikhs that Saudi Arabia have been funding and Qatar's TV channel Al Jazeera did the rest. ISIS was born in 2006 in the fertile soil of the Iraq War that Australia was dragged into. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before the war began. The violence that people were exposed to there pushed many into instability. An ex-Marine flipped out in Pennsylvania yesterday and went on a shooting spree. And Abbott yesterday said that we are a peaceful country, but Australia is getting dragged into the Iraq War again. Because to our American allies, you're either with them or else. This is why our government hasn't been speaking out about the US duplicitous policy of backing terrorism to overthrow governments that has caused Al-Qaeda and ISIS to grow exponentially and has put us all in danger. We see, the crazy politicians don't care if their policies cause terrorism back home because they don't really care about their own people. And the American people are victims of this also. The police might care, individuals might care, but at the end of the day, most politicians only care about one thing, their seat of power. And so, the Australian people are kept in the dark. I wonder about the victims of the Sydney siege, Tory Johnson and Katrina Dawson. They had nothing to do with this. They didn't even know anything about it. I wonder if the same politicians that inadvertently caused their death are going to use their death to advertise themselves and to promote the spread of more war and chaos. Where is the justice in that? And none are the wiser. How can we keep letting them get away with it? It's up to us to keep a close eye on what's happening in the world, because at the end of the day, the responsibility we spoke about at the start lies with us.